house on Sycamore Drive looked like something out of a catalog. Brick front, white shutters, a porch with two rocking chairs that nobody ever sat in. My neighbor Edna used to say it looked like the kind of house where nothing bad ever happened. She was wrong about that. I moved in with my second husband 14 months after we got married, and by then, I had already learned to measure my words before I spoke them. Not because he yelled. He never yelled. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it worse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. I was 62 when I met him. My first husband, Lou, had passed 3 years before, pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. 26 years we had together, and then I was standing at a graveside in November trying to remember how to breathe. My daughter Cynthia flew in from Portland. My son kept calling from Atlanta. Everyone was very kind. And then everyone went back to their lives, which is what people do, and I went back to mine, which by then felt like wearing a coat that didn't fit anymore. I wasn't looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that because I know how these stories sound. Lonely widow falls for the first man who pays attention. It wasn't like that. I had a full life. I volunteered at the library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I had a ceramics class on Wednesdays that I loved so much, I'd been taking it for 4 years. I had my garden, my book club, my morning walks. I had Cynthia calling every Sunday without fail. I was lonely, yes, but I was managing. His name was Stuart. I met him at a benefit auction for the Children's Hospital. A mutual friend of ours had organized it, and she'd seated us at the same table because she thought, and I quote, that we were both such interesting conversationalists. He was 67, recently retired from 30 years as a civil engineer. He had warm eyes and laugh lines, and he asked me questions and actually listened to the answers, which I noticed because a lot of people don't. He talked about his late wife, Miriam. She died 4 years before from a stroke, with this kind of quiet tenderness that I found moving. He clearly missed her. That seemed like a good sign to me. That seemed like it meant he was capable of loving someone deeply. I should have paid more attention to what it meant that he couldn't stop. We dated for 8 months. He brought me flowers, not roses, wildflowers, because I'd mentioned once in passing that I preferred them. He remembered things. He was attentive in a way that felt, at the time, like being cherished. He met Cynthia when she came to visit and charmed her completely. He fixed the broken step on my back porch without being asked. He seemed in every visible way like a good man. We got married at the courthouse with Cynthia and his son Owen as witnesses. Small, quiet. I kept my house. I want to be clear about that too. I kept my house and rented it to a young couple, a decision Stuart said he fully supported. We would live in his house on Sycamore Drive. It was bigger, he said, more practical. I brought my mother's quilt, my ceramic pieces, the framed photo of Lou and me at the Grand Canyon that had sat on my dresser for 15 years. Lou had been gone 4 years by then. I was not bringing him into a new marriage as a ghost. He was part of my history, the way your history lives in your bones. I thought Stuart understood that. The first comparison came 6 days after we moved in together. I was making pot roast, a recipe I'd been cooking for 30 years. I set the table, lit a candle, felt optimistic about things. Stuart came in from the garage, looked at the table, and said with no particular edge in his voice, "That was always the thing. There was never an edge. Miriam used to put the candles in the center." Said it opened up the sides for the serving dishes. I moved the candle. I don't know why I moved it. I just did. And he smiled and said, "That's better." And we sat down to eat, and I told myself it was nothing, a small preference. People have preferences. The second comparison came 3 days later. I'd rearranged the spice cabinet because I couldn't find anything in the original arrangement, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and said that Miriam had organized it alphabetically, and he'd always found that very practical. Didn't I think that was practical? I reorganized it alphabetically. I want you to understand something. These first weeks, I wasn't frightened. I wasn't even particularly upset. I was accommodating. I was 62 years old, and I had spent a lifetime being a person who keeps the peace, and each individual thing seemed small enough to simply do. Move the candle. Reorganize the cabinet. Of course, a new marriage required adjustment. It was only later, when I tried to count them, that I understood how many adjustments there had been. By the third month, I had stopped making pot roast because Miriam had made a better one. A recipe from her grandmother, he explained, and he'd given me the recipe once, but I'd put in too much rosemary. By the fourth month, I had moved my mother's quilt to the back of the closet because he said the pattern clashed with the bedroom decor. The framed photo of Lou and me stayed in a drawer because he'd said, very gently, that it made things feel confused. For him, he meant, though he didn't say that exactly. He said it might be hard for both of us to have photos of our former spouses out, and he quietly removed a photo of Miriam from the mantel at the same time, presenting it as a mutual agreement, a partnership decision. I thought that was fair. I thought we were navigating something difficult together. What I didn't understand was that the photo of Miriam had never needed to be on the mantle for her to be present in that house. She was in the way he arranged the living room. She was in the recipes I failed to replicate. She was in the way he looked at me sometimes when I laughed too loudly. Miriam, he once said, had a very soft laugh, musical. People always commented on it. I started laughing more quietly. My ceramics class was on Wednesday evenings, 6 to 8:30. I had been going for 4 years, and the women in that class were some of my closest friends. Harriet, who I'd known since before Lou died, and two others I'd grown genuinely fond of over those years. It was the part of my week I looked forward to most. The weight of clay under my hands, the way you could make something from nothing, the conversation, the laughing. Stuart came with me the first time I went after we married. Not inside. He waited in the car, and when I came out, he was quiet on the drive home. The next week, he asked whether the class was really necessary, since I was retired and had plenty of time for hobbies during the day. I explained that the evening was part of it, the social part, the time with friends. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. The week after that, he called me while I was in the middle of throwing a bowl and asked when I'd be home because he didn't feel well. I left early. He was fine by the time I got there, just tired, he said. After that, there was always something on Wednesday evenings, a repair that needed attention, a bill that had to be sorted, an invitation from his son Owen that Stuart wanted to discuss. None of it was large enough to name. All of it was sufficient to interrupt, to abbreviate, to eventually make the class feel like an imposition rather than a pleasure. I stopped going in the 7th month. I told Harriet I was just busy settling into a new marriage. She said she understood. She asked twice after that if I was all right, and I said I was, because what was I going to tell her? That my husband didn't forbid me from going to ceramics class? He simply made it very inconvenient? That would have sounded absurd. It sounded absurd even in my own head. What was harder to explain, even to myself, was the way my own judgment had started to feel unreliable. There was a dinner with Stuart's friends, 3 couples he'd known for years, all of them gracious, all of them fond of him, all of them full of stories about Miriam. How wonderful she was, how warm, how she had this way of making everyone feel welcome. I smiled and I nodded and I passed the breadbasket, and I felt very distinctly like a woman auditioning for a role she'd already been told she wasn't right for. On the drive home, I said carefully that it had been a little difficult to hear so much about her. Not that I begrudged her memory. I didn't. Truly I didn't. But that I'd felt invisible. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Miriam had never been the jealous type. I looked out the window and said nothing. There were good stretches, and this is important to say because it's true, and also because it's part of how these things work. He could be genuinely kind. He helped me navigate a complicated insurance issue after a fender bender in November. He drove me to my cataract surgery and sat in the waiting room the whole time and brought me soup when we got home. There were evenings on the back porch where we talked easily, where I could almost locate the man I'd married. I held on to those evenings. I also stopped calling Cynthia as much. Not because Stuart told me not to. He never said anything about it. But I'd mentioned once that I was talking to her, and he'd said, thoughtfully, that his son had worried when his father got remarried, that adult children sometimes had trouble adjusting, that he hoped I wasn't saying things that might make Cynthia worry unnecessarily. He was thinking of me, he said, wanting to protect my relationship with my daughter. I started editing what I said to Cynthia, and then I called less because the editing was exhausting. The trouble is that when you start moving in smaller and smaller circles, you don't notice how small they've gotten until you're standing in the kitchen at 6 p.m. trying to remember what you used to think about, and your mind is blank. That was the winter. The second winter. I wasn't sleeping well. I had headaches that my doctor attributed to stress. I'd lost 11 pounds without trying. I told her I was adjusting to a new marriage. She looked at me for a moment and then wrote something in her chart. I was very tired all the time. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that sits behind your eyes. It was a Tuesday in March when it happened. I was making dinner, chicken and vegetables, nothing complicated, a sheet pan meal I could do in my sleep. I remember the radio was on, a program I liked. I remember reaching for the oven mitt. And then I was on the floor. I hadn't fainted before in my life. It took me a moment to understand what had happened. I was looking up at the kitchen ceiling and my hip hurt, and there was a pot on the stove still going, and I thought I should turn it off. I need to turn off the stove. Stuart was there quickly. He helped me up. He was solicitous, alarmed. He drove me to the emergency room himself, which I was grateful for. In the car, he told me, once and then again, that I'd probably just stood up too fast. These things happened, low blood pressure, possibly I hadn't eaten enough that day. He told the intake nurse that I'd tripped over the dog. I heard him say it. I hadn't tripped over anything. We didn't even own a dog. I don't know why that particular moment was the one. I had swallowed so many things. I had moved candles and reorganized cabinets and stopped going to ceramics class and stopped calling my daughter freely and stopped laughing too loudly. I had made myself quieter and smaller and more acceptable, and I had called it marriage. But lying in a hospital bed while a man told a stranger I tripped over a dog we didn't have, there was something about that small, unnecessary lie, something about the casual ease of it that cracked something open in me. The doctor was a woman about Cynthia's age. She came in while Stuart was getting coffee, and she asked me in a very straightforward way whether there was anything I wanted to tell her. Just me and her, she said. She wasn't looking at her clipboard when she asked. I said I didn't know where to start. She sat down. It came out in pieces. Not the dramatic version. There was no dramatic version. I told her about the fatigue, the weight loss, the headaches. She asked questions and I answered them honestly, and at some point I was talking about ceramics class and Miriam's laugh and the spice cabinet, and I stopped feeling foolish. Because how did any of that belong in a doctor's office? She said it belonged there very much. She ran tests, blood work, blood pressure, all of it. And she also gave me the number for a social worker on staff, and she said without any particular pressure that what I described had a name, that it happened more than people knew. That it happened to capable, intelligent women of all ages who loved their husbands and wanted their marriages to work. I held the paper with the phone number on it and I thought about Miriam, not with any anger toward her. She was a dead woman. She hadn't done anything to me. I thought about whether she'd moved candles, whether she'd stopped going to things she loved, whether she'd edited herself down slowly until the editing became the whole occupation. I thought about the 26 years I had with Lou, which were not perfect years, no 26 years are, but in which I had never once felt like I was failing an audition. He had known exactly who he married. He had wanted her specifically, flaws and all, loud laugh and too much rosemary in the pot roast and opinions about where the candles went. I called the social worker the next morning. Her name was Pearl, and she was practical and kind. And she did not tell me what to do. She helped me think through what I had and what I needed and what the next steps might look like. I called Cynthia that afternoon, full version, no editing. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "Mom, I've been waiting for this call for 8 months." She had noticed. She had been watching me get smaller, and she hadn't known how to say it, and she'd been afraid of pushing me away. We sat on the phone and cried a little, and then we started making a plan. My tenant's lease was up in April. I had kept that house, my house, the one that had my garden out back and the original kitchen tiles I'd always loved and the good light in the afternoons. I had kept it because something in me had known, without letting myself fully know, that I might need it. I filed for divorce in the third week of March. Stuart was surprised. He wanted to talk, to understand what had happened, to fix it. He said I was making a decision in an emotional state. He said Miriam would never have walked away from a problem without trying to solve it. That was the last time he said her name to me. I said that I wasn't Miriam. I said I didn't need him to understand my reasons. I said I hoped he found peace, and I meant it, and I walked out to my daughter's car. The tenants moved out at the end of April. I moved back in the first week of May. The first thing I did was take my mother's quilt out of the box and put it back on the bed where it belonged. I went back to ceramics class in June. Harriet had kept my spot, the second wheel on the left, the one with the good stool. She didn't make a big thing of it. She just said, "You're back," and handed me an apron. I want to say something to anyone who might be listening to this and feeling something they recognize. It doesn't have to be dramatic to be real. Nobody has to raise a hand. Nobody has to raise a hand. Nobody has to scream. You can be in a house with a man who brings you wildflowers and drives you to surgery and is very well liked by his friends, and still find yourself, over time, erased. The signs are things like this. You stop doing the things you loved, and you're not sure when you decided to stop. You edit what you say to the people who love you. You feel like you're always almost getting it right, but never quite. You are tired in a way that isn't about sleep. That is not a marriage problem. You can reorganize your spice cabinet to fix. I am 64 years old now, and I wake up in my own house in the good morning light, and I make my coffee the way I like it. And sometimes I put the candles wherever I feel like, and sometimes I call Cynthia twice in one day just because I want to. I am going on a trip to New Mexico in the fall because I've always wanted to see Taos, and I just booked it last week without asking anyone. My ceramics class has an exhibit in September. I made a set of 4 bowls this spring that I am genuinely proud of. They're uneven, a little rough in places. I think they're beautiful. You are not too old to leave. You're not too far in. You're not overreacting. You are not the problem. You're stronger than you know. You were just being very quiet about it for a while. I think about cause and effect a lot these days. Not in some grand philosophical way, just in the plain, ordinary way of a woman sitting on her own porch with her coffee, looking back at a road she walked and trying to understand how she got where she did. Stuart didn't set out to destroy me. I actually believe that. I think he loved me in the way he was capable of loving, which was a way that required me to fit a shape I hadn't agreed to. Every time he compared me to Miriam, every time I moved the candle or reorganized the cabinet or left ceramics class early, I told myself those were small things, reasonable adjustments. What I didn't see was that each one was a choice. His choice to measure me against a dead woman, and my choice to accept the measuring. That's the hard part to sit with. I was not a passive victim of some outside force. I was an active participant in my own disappearance. Not because I was foolish, I don't believe that anymore, but because I had spent 62 years being someone who kept the peace, and that habit was so deeply worn into me that I didn't recognize it as a habit. I thought it was just who I was. It wasn't who I was. It was what I'd learned to do. And what you learn, you can unlearn. That's the thing nobody tells you at 62. Or 64, or whatever age you happen to be reading your own life, like a map you've been holding upside down. The learning and the unlearning are both available to you. The door doesn't close. When I walked out to Cynthia's car that afternoon, I wasn't brave. I want to be honest about that. I was exhausted and a little numb, and my hips still hurt from the fall. Bravery is something you feel in your chest, some bright, expanding thing. What I felt was more like a door swinging shut behind me with a quiet final click. Not dramatic, just done. But the consequences of that one decision, that tired, unheroic, completely ordinary decision, have been extraordinary. I sleep well now. I eat well. I gained back 9 of the 11 pounds. I laugh at full volume. I went to Taos in October and stood in the desert light for a long time without thinking about anyone's opinion of me. And I understood something then that I couldn't have told you in words, that your life belongs to you. Not to the shape someone else needs you to fit, not to the piece you've always kept, to you. Harriet asked me once, not long after I came back to class, whether I regretted marrying Stuart. I thought about it honestly. I said no, not because it didn't hurt. It hurt considerably, but because the marriage showed me something about myself I hadn't wanted to look at, which was how far I would go to be acceptable. Knowing that is worth something. Acting on it is worth more. What you allow continues. What you stop allowing stops. It really is that simple, and it really is that hard, and it really is completely possible. My bowls from the September exhibit are on the shelf by the kitchen window now, where the morning light hits them. They're uneven, a little rough. Nobody's ideal of perfect. I think they're exactly right.